The north is cold and full of whispers.
The trunk smelled like him. Not the way memory softens a dead man into something bearable, not the sweet lie grief tells you in the dark. It smelled like Ned Stark exactly as he had been, oiled leather and cold iron, and the particular northern musk of a man who had spent 40 years standing in wind that came off a gray sea. Catelyn had opened it 4 times since his effects arrived from King's Landing, packed by strangers who did not know which items mattered and which did not. Each time she had taken what she needed, a letter, a seal, a writ for Robb's counsel, and closed it again quickly, the way you close a wound. Tonight, she had no reason to open it. That was why she opened it. The camp was quiet at this hour. The third watch had taken their posts. The fires were banked down to coals, and orange light moved through the tense canvas walls the way it moves through eyelids when you are trying to sleep and cannot. She could hear Robb's guards outside. She could hear the river. She could not sleep, because tomorrow she would ride south to meet Renly Baratheon. And every instinct Hoster Tully had ever drilled into his eldest daughter told her that Renly was the wrong move, and she was making it anyway, because there were no right moves left. She lifted the trunk's lid, set it against the bed frame. Ned had not been a man of possessions. That was the first thing she had thought when the trunk arrived, how light it was. A sealing ring. 3 letters she recognized as hers, folded small and kept, a knife with a bone handle she had never seen him carry, a child's drawing, badly done, that she thought might be Bran's. A man who had ruled the north for 20 years had died leaving less behind than a merchant's apprentice. That had undone her more than anything. Not the news, not the journey north to tell Robb. The weight of the trunk. She moved through the items slowly. She was not looking for anything. Her fingers found the seam on the 3rd pass. It was along the inside of the base, right-hand corner. The inner lining of the trunk was dark wool, stitched down flat, and where the wool met the leather side panel, the stitching changed. Catelyn's hands went still. She had watched Ned repair his riding gloves on winter evenings when he could not sleep, small, tight stitches, controlled, pressing inward so the thread would not catch and pull. These were his stitches, not the craftsman who had built the trunk. His. She reached for the knife on the bedroll beside her. The seam gave without sound. Beneath the wool, a fold of oilskin, sealed with plain wax. No sigil. The wax was old, years old, brittle at the edges, as if it had been pressed and never meant to be opened unless there was no other choice. Catelyn held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing. A folded piece of parchment. That was all. She broke the wax. The handwriting stopped her breath. She had seen Lyanna Stark's writing once, in the Winterfell records, a betrothal letter to Robert Baratheon, written in the looping, self-taught hand of a girl who had learned her letters young and practiced them on stone instead of vellum. Wide letters. A heavy press on the downstroke, a distinctive curve at the end of every word, like the writer was reluctant to lift the quill. This was that hand. Catelyn read the letter. She read it once, and she did not believe it. The body does that. When the information is too large, the mind simply refuses. She read the words and understood each one individually, and reached the end of the page, and knew she had understood nothing. She turned the parchment over. There was nothing on the back. She turned it again. She read it a second time. The name Rhaegar appeared in the 3rd line. The phrase "our son" appeared in the 7th. The name Aegon appeared near the end, in writing slightly heavier than the rest, as if Lyanna had pressed harder on that word than on any other, as if naming the child had cost her something the rest of the letter had not. The last line read, "Promise me, Ned." Catelyn set the letter down on her knee. She looked at the tent wall. The coals popped once in the fire pit. Outside, one of the guards said something low, and the other laughed. And then it was quiet again. She had heard Ned say those words in his sleep. Promise me. She had asked him once, years into their marriage. Lying in the dark of Winterfell's lord's chamber what he dreamed about, he had said nothing. He had turned toward the wall. She read the letter a 3rd time. This time she let herself believe it. This time she followed the logic the way her father had taught her. You take the worst possibility, you assume it is true, and you count the cost. Rhaegar Targaryen. Lyanna Stark. A secret marriage. A child born in a tower in Dorne while a war was fought below it. A boy given to Ned Stark to carry home, to shelter, to lie for, to raise as his own shame so that no one would look too closely, so that Robert Baratheon would never know that the woman he had burned the Seven Kingdoms for had chosen a different man. And that boy was at the wall. That boy had gray eyes and dark hair, and a face so stark he might have walked out of the crypt beside Brandon or Benjen or Ned himself, and for 17 years Catelyn had looked at that face and seen evidence of her husband's betrayal. She had been wrong. Every hour of 17 years she had been wrong. She read the letter a fourth time. This time she was not reading it for herself. She was reading it for Robb. Bran and Rickon. Presumed dead, Theon's betrayal still a raw wound in the North's memory. Sansa, married to Tyrion Lannister, sitting in the Red Keep behind walls Robb could not break, a hostage dressed in silk. Arya, missing for so long now that missing had started to feel like its own category of grief, different from dead, worse in some ways. Robb. Her son, her king. 16 years old, and carrying the weight of the North on shoulders that were still filling out, married to a woman he loved, but who had not yet given him an heir, fighting a war that even the generals with gray in their beards could not promise him he would win. The Stark line was one battle away from ending, and in her hands she held the only Stark blood left in the world that was free. That was healthy. That was undiscovered. A man with a greatsword and a direwolf, and a Targaryen name he had never been allowed to use, saying vows in black wool on a frozen wall, guarding a realm that did not know who he was. Catelyn folded the letter, tucked it inside her riding glove, against her palm. She sat with it for a moment longer, the coals orange moving across the tent walls. The river turning outside, Renly Baratheon's camp 2 days south. Then she stood. Her escort was 4 men, camped 30 feet from her tent. She pulled back the canvas flap and stepped into the cold. The grass was wet with it, the kind of cold that means a few hours until dawn. "My lady." The nearest guard straightened. "Is something wrong?" "We are not going to Renly." She said it the way Ned had always delivered difficult news, plainly, without apology, as if the decision had been made so long ago there was nothing left to argue. "Wake the others. Break down the camp." "My lady, Lord Robb's instructions are superseded by mine." She met the man's eyes, and whatever he saw there made him stop. "We ride north." Now, she did not explain. She did not have to. She was Catelyn Tully Stark, Lady of Winterfell, and she had ridden in the wrong direction for 17 years. Behind her, the camp came awake in the dark whispered voices, the clink of tack and buckles, horses blowing white breath into the cold air. She mounted without help. She did not look south toward the Stormlands, toward Renly's banners and Renly's promises, and the road she had spent a week planning to take. She looked north. The first hoof falls were loud in the dark. Then, the whole column was moving, and the sound swallowed the individual sounds, and the campfires shrank behind them, and somewhere back there in the direction she was leaving. Renly Baratheon's name grew smaller and smaller until the river noise took it entirely. The dew was coming up on the grass. It smelled like the riverlands at the end of summer, green and cold and a little like the rain that was still a day away. She rode. The neck smelled like the bottom of something. Not the bottom of a well or a dungeon, nothing so simple. The bottom of a continent, maybe the place where the land ran out of confidence and dissolved into water and grass and that particular gray-green light that existed nowhere else in the Seven Kingdoms. Catelyn had crossed the neck once before, riding north to marry a man she had never met. She had been 20 years old and terrified in the clean way that young people are terrified. Afraid of the future, not yet acquainted with the past. The neck had frightened her then, the floating smell of decay beneath the grass, the sounds at night that had no clear source. It did not frighten her now. She had a worse thing to carry than fear. They were 6 riders, which was not enough. She knew that. She had known it when she turned north at the Riverlands camp. When she counted her escort in the dark and found 4 men plus herself plus Sir Desmond Grell, who was 55 years old and loyal unto death, and had not slept more than 3 hours since they left. 6 riders was a traveling party. It was not a war column. If they met anything that wanted to fight them, they would lose. She found out what was on the road at mid-morning of the 11th day. Sir Desmond saw them first, the glint off salt rusted iron, wrong color for the light, too regular to be water. He said nothing. He dropped back to ride beside her and said, very quietly, Ironborn. 8 of them. Moving south on the road ahead, Catelyn looked past his shoulder. The road was straight here, cutting through high marsh grass on both sides. Visibility perhaps 400 yards before it bent behind a stand of dead willows. She could see the shapes of horsemen. They were not moving fast. Scouts move slowly on unfamiliar ground. They haven't seen us? Not yet, she thought for 3 seconds. An Ironborn patrol on the King's Road through the Neck meant what it always meant: someone was testing a route. Testing it meant someone was planning to use it. 8 men was not a raiding party. 8 men was eyes ahead of a larger force, and if those eyes came back south and reported a small Riverlands column moving north on the road, she would have that larger force on her heels before she cleared the bog. Wendell, she spoke without turning her head. Harwick, you two take the road. Make noise. Argue with each other. Sound like merchants who have had too much to drink since morning. She looked at Desmond. The bog paths. There's a route that runs parallel to the King's Road through the marsh. Crannogmen use it. I rode it once, coming north to Winterfell, single file. The horses will hate it, but they'll manage. My lady. Desmond kept his voice very level. That was 15 years ago. I remember it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and did not say anything else. That was why she valued him. Wendell and Harwick peeled off toward the road, already raising their voices in the theatrical dispute she had asked for, something about a wheel tax and a dishonest innkeeper, loud enough to carry. She heard one of them laugh. Good, laughing men do not sound like threats. Ironborn scouts look for threats. She took the other 4 into the grass. The bog path was where she remembered it, which surprised her. Memory does strange things with landscape, compresses some distances, stretches others, loses details that seemed important, and preserves ones that seemed trivial. She had remembered the path as wider. It was not wide. It was a track just broad enough for a horse if the horse was patient, and the rider did not panic, winding through marsh grass taller than a mounted man, the ground soft enough that each hoof fall was a negotiation. The smell was profound. Old water and green rot, and the particular sweetness of things decomposing slowly in the cold. She rode at the front. She did not look back. The bog absorbed sound the way wool absorbs water, gradually, completely, until there was nothing left. Behind her she could still hear, faintly, Wendell and Harwick's performance on the road. Then she could not. Then there was only the soft percussion of hooves in mud, and the creak of tack, and the wind off the marsh, which smelled like nothing that had a name. She did not think about Ned. She thought about the path. She watched the ground color. Darker meant softer, meant danger, and she watched the grass for the subtle ways it leaned to indicate where the water moved beneath, and she did not think about Ned. She thought about him anyway. He had been here once, also riding north, also carrying something he could not set down. Carrying a baby wrapped in cloth, a baby with dark hair and stark gray eyes, a baby whose existence required a lie that would follow Ned Stark like a second shadow for the rest of his life. She tried to imagine him on this road, or some road like it, the same gray sky, the same neck smell, and she could not make the image hold. Ned was Winterfell. Ned was the crypts and the godswood and the carved stone kings with their iron swords. Ned was not a man in transit. He was a man who had arrived somewhere long before she met him and would never be anywhere else. And yet, he had been on that road. He had been 26 years old and riding home with a secret that would outlive him. She had hated his secret. She had hated the boy the secret produced. She had looked at Jon Snow's face 10,000 times across 17 years of meals and feasts and sparring yards, and had seen only evidence of a betrayal that had not occurred. She had been so certain. Certainty had been the structure she built her hatred on, and now the structure was gone, and what was left was not forgiveness. She was not ready for that word. Not yet. What was left was the particular weight of a woman who has spent 17 years being wrong. The path turned north. She followed it. They came out of the bog 3 miles ahead of where they had entered the grass. The king's road reappeared to their right. She waited, listening, no sound of pursuit. She counted to 60, then to 60 again. Behind her, Sir Desmond's horse blew a long breath. One of the younger men muttered something she did not catch. Then, from the south, the sound of 2 horses moving at a canter. She had her hand on her knife before she recognized the voices. Wendell first, then Harwick, laughing again, the laugh of men who have just done something that worked. They emerged from the road bend and pulled up alongside her, both muddy, both grinning. "Took the bait," Wendell said. "Watched them follow us north about half a mile, then we looped back through that shallow crossing east of the willows. They're still looking." "Good." She turned north without ceremony. "We ride." The way station was a stone structure, barely, 4 walls and most of a roof, maintained by no one but used by everyone who crossed the neck, crannogmen, traveling merchants. The occasional Night's Watch recruiter moving south. There was a fire ring inside and evidence of recent use, ash that was 2 days old at most, a broken piece of harness hanging from a nail. 2 riders were waiting outside it. Catelyn's escort had hands on hilts before she raised her palm. She had seen the horses first, small, swamp-bred. The compact and unglamorous animals that the crannogmen preferred because they could move through shallow water without breaking stride. And she had seen the net, coiled over the shoulder of the smaller of the 2 riders, fine-meshed, weighted at the edges. A hunting net, a fighting net, if needed. The girl was young. 16, perhaps, small-framed, with a watchful quality about the eyes that Catelyn associated with people who had grown up in places where being unaware meant being dead. She held herself easy in the saddle. Beside her, a boy, younger, thinner, with an unfocused look that was not inattention, but something else, something Catelyn could not name. "My Lady Stark." The girl's voice was clear. "I am Mira Reed. This is my brother Jojen. Our father sends his apologies for the absence and his word in place of it." She extended a letter. Catelyn dismounted. She took the letter the way she had taken Lyanna's, with both hands, feeling the weight before she read it. The seal was the sigil of House Reed, a lizard lion, roughly stamped into plain wax, nothing decorative about it. The wax was still slightly warm. This letter had been written recently, sealed recently, given to these children days ago and carried fast. She broke it. "Read it." Howland Reed wrote the way men write when they have kept a secret long enough that releasing it feels like setting down something very heavy. He did not waste words. He named the Tower of Joy. He named what he had seen inside it. He named the child he had watched Ned Stark carry out of that tower wrapped in cloth, and he named the promise Ned had made before they rode south, and he named what the child's name had been before the road between Dorne and Winterfell turned it into something safer. He did not name everything. At the letter's end, he wrote only some things the boy should hear from his own blood. "I will come when he is ready to hear them, not before." Catelyn folded the letter, placed it inside her riding glove, beside Lyanna's. 2 letters now, both written by people who were present, both naming the same child, both silent for 17 years because the truth had been more dangerous than the lie. "Your father is well?" she asked. "He is," Mira said. "He has not slept since the Raven arrived. But he is well." Catelyn looked north. The sky above the neck was the color of old pewter, not stormy, just overcast, the way it was above the wall for months at a time, the light coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Then we ride," she said. Castle Black was not a castle. That was the first thing. She had known it intellectually, had heard the Night's Watch described as underfunded, undermanned, stripped of resources by centuries of southern lords who considered the Watch a dumping ground for problems they did not want to look at. She had heard all of that, and it had not prepared her for the reality of riding through the gate and finding something that looked less like a fortress and more like a very large ruin that had not yet finished deciding what it was going to become. The stone was black, not the black of good granite, the black of walls that had been sealed and resealed and patched and repatched, and were now many different kinds of stone under a uniform skin of age and weather. The yard was cold in the specific way of places that the sun touches briefly and then loses interest in. There was laundry frozen on a line. There were men who stopped what they were doing to stare at her the way men stare when something appears that has no business being where it is. The gate guard was 19 years old at most. He had the kind of face that suggested he had not yet grown into it, jaw too wide, eyes set too close, a serious expression he was clearly practicing. He looked at her escort. He looked at the Tully trout on Sir Desmond's cloak. He looked at Catelyn. "My lady." He said it carefully, like a word in a language he had studied but never spoken aloud. "The watch doesn't receive. That is, we aren't." He stopped. "Started again. Is there something I can help you with?" "I need to speak with your Lord Commander," Catelyn said. "And your maester. Now, if possible. Before anything else." He sent a boy at a run. She dismounted in the yard and stood and waited and felt every eye in the castle on her back. Jorah Mormont was a large man going old in the way that large men do, the weight settling lower, the neck thickening, the hair retreating in an orderly fashion from a face that had not yet decided to follow. He received her in what served as his solar, a room that smelled of dog and tallow and old parchment, with Mormont's raven perched on a stand in the corner, watching the proceedings with the raven's particular quality of attention that made you feel observed and judged and found slightly wanting. "Lady Stark." He stood when she entered, a courtesy she had not expected. "We received no raven. I sent none." He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat, and she sat, and he poured 2 cups of something that was not wine but was warm, and she wrapped her hands around the cup and did not drink it. "I need your maester," she said. "Aemon is. I know who he is." She set the cup down. "I need to speak with him before I explain why I have come. I need to hear something from him before I can explain the rest. I understand this is an unusual request." Jorah Mormont had spent 30 years commanding men that polite society had decided it was done with. He was not a man who unsettled easily. He studied her face for a moment, looking for the shape of whatever she was carrying, the way an experienced man reads a situation before it speaks. And then he sent for the maester without asking another question. That single act of trust told her something useful about him, and about his relationship with the boy she had come to find. Maester Aemon was led out by a steward who held his elbow with the practiced lightness of someone who had learned exactly how much guidance the old man wanted, and had long since stopped offering more than that. He was very small. That was the second thing. The first was his age, which was not a number but an atmosphere, something you felt when he entered the room the way you feel a cold draft from an open window before you see the window itself. He had been alive for so long that existence seemed to have compressed him, the way wood compresses under weight over years. Growing denser and harder and less than it once was in size, but more than it once was in everything else. He was blind. The eyes were open and showed nothing. He did not need to be told where to sit. He found the chair on his own and settled into it, and folded his hands in his lap, and turned his face toward Catelyn with a precision that suggested blindness was a recent inconvenience rather than a condition of long standing. "Lady Stark," he said. His voice was the only thing about him that had not compressed with age. It was clear and exact. A voice that had been used carefully for a very long time. "You have come a long way. Yes, you did not come for Jon's sake only." He said it without hesitation, without the upward inflection of a question. He was not asking. "You came because of what you found. Something you were not meant to find, that Ned Stark left behind him. Something that changed the direction of your riding before you reached Renly Baratheon's camp." The room was very quiet. In the corner, Mormont's raven turned its head. "How?" Catelyn said, and stopped. Tried again. "How do you know about Renly?" "I don't. I know about Jon." Aemon's hands did not move in his lap. "I have known for some time." Not from anyone's confession. Ned Stark was not a man who confessed things. "But I am old enough, and I have been a Targaryen long enough, to recognize what I am standing near, even blind. Even here." He paused. "He does not know I know. I have never told him. It was not mine to tell." Catelyn placed Lyanna's letter on the table between them. Aemon could not see it. She described it, the handwriting, the date, the specific phrases, the child's true name. She watched his face while she spoke, and his face did not change, But his hands changed. They tightened once, briefly, and then released, and after that they were still again in a way that was different from their previous stillness. "She named him Aegon," Aemon said, when she had finished. Yes, the maester was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire settled, long enough that Mormont shifted his weight in his chair. Then Aemon said, very quietly, to no one in the room specifically, "I gave up a crown so that my family could survive. I have sat on this wall for 60 years, wondering if the sacrifice served anything." He turned his face toward the window that he could not see through. "Now I know." The Raven reached the ranging party 8 days later. Mormont wrote it himself. Jon arrived 4 days after that. He came through the north gate at mid-afternoon, riding a horse that had been pushed and knew it, in a column of 12 men, all of them cold in the laird. Ground in way that men are cold after 2 weeks beyond the wall. He had grown. That was Catelyn's first thought, standing in the yard, watching him ride in. Not taller necessarily, but broader through the shoulders, and there was something in the way he held himself on the horse, an economy of movement, nothing wasted, that had not been there when he had left Winterfell years ago. He saw her from 20 yards out. She watched his face do 3 things in rapid succession: recognize her, understand that she was here and not in the Riverlands and not dead, and then close. Not coldly. Carefully, the way you close a shutter against weather you have decided to wait out. He dismounted, handed his reins to a stable boy without looking at him, walked toward her, and stopped 8 feet away and did not close the remaining distance. He waited. Ghost appeared from somewhere to Jon's left, moving without sound on the packed snow of the yard, and sat at Jon's heel. The direwolf looked at Catelyn with red eyes that held no warmth and no hostility, only attention. "Lady Stark." Jon's voice was even, not cold, even, a voice that had learned to hold still under pressure. "Jon." She looked at him, at the stark gray of his eyes, at the jaw that was Lyanna's jaw, and only Lyanna's jaw, at the dark hair and the careful face of a young man who had spent years in a place that required you to be more than you were. "I have something that belongs to you." "Lord Stark is dead," he said. Not cruelly, just establishing what he knew, what ground they were standing on. "Yes." She reached into her riding cloak, drew out the oilskin fold, flattened now, worn at the edges from the weeks of road. "But he left this behind." She held it out. "It is written in your mother's hand." Jon looked at the letter. He looked at her face. She could not read what passed through his eyes in that moment. It moved too quickly, behind too many walls. He reached for it. He read it standing up. That was the first thing Catelyn noticed, that he did not move to sit, did not lean against the wall, did not seek any support from the physical world while the parchment in his hands rearranged everything he knew about himself. He stood in the center of the yard in his black wool and his road dirt, and he read Lyanna Stark's letter the way men read sentences handed down by judges, very still, weight distributed evenly, prepared for the impact before it arrived. He read it once. His face did not change, not a tightening around the eyes, not a shift in the jaw. Ghost, sitting at his heel, had gone absolutely motionless, the direwolf's attention fixed on Jon with an intensity that had nothing to do with the yard or the cold, or the other men moving at the edges of the space. Only on Jon. As if the wolf felt something moving beneath the surface of its master, that the master himself had not yet allowed to surface. Jon read the letter a second time. When he lowered the parchment, he looked at the wall, not at Catelyn, not at the gate or the yard or any of the 8 men who had stopped what they were doing to watch without knowing what they were watching. He looked at the wall, 700 feet of ancient ice rising behind Castle Black's rooftops, gray-blue in the afternoon light. Massive in the way that things are massive when they have existed long enough to stop being remarkable to the people who live beside them. Jon looked at it for a long moment, as if he were measuring himself against it. Then Maester Aemon spoke from the doorway of the solar where Mormont had brought him to wait. "Come inside," Aemon said. "Both of you. What happens next should not happen in a yard." The solar was warm. Catelyn had not realized how cold she was until the warmth of it reached her face, and her face told her. She stood near the fire. Jon stood near the door. Between them, the letter sat on the table, and Aemon sat in his chair, and the distance between Jon and the table was the distance between a man and a thing he was not yet sure he was allowed to want. "She names you Aegon Targaryen," Aemon said. He did not phrase it as a question or a revelation. He stated it the way a maester states the outcome of a diagnosis. "Here is what is true. Now we discuss what follows. The name your father chose." Jon said nothing. Rhaegar chose that name for reasons that were his own. Aemon's hands rested in his lap, still as always. "I will not tell you those reasons were good reasons." He was a man who read too deeply in old books, and came out the other side believing he had discovered something no one else had seen. He was frequently wrong about specific things and occasionally right about large ones, and the combination was dangerous. He paused. But he was not the monster the realm made of him after his death. He was not his father. He did not burn things. He was a man who wept when he read of prophecy. Ravens from court described him in those years, and even a blind man on a frozen wall receives letters from the world he left behind. What those ravens described was not a monster. Jon looked at the old man. "You're telling me who he was. I am telling you who you come from. There is a difference." Aemon turned his face toward the fire he could not see. "You come from a man who made catastrophic choices in the service of something he believed was larger than himself. You also come from a woman who rode a horse like she was angry at the ground and loved her brother with a fierceness that produced a war. You come from both of those people. What you do with the combination is yours to determine." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved along the wall's face and produced a sound that was not quite a moan and not quite anything else, the specific complaint of ice under pressure. "I am not Ned Stark's son," Jon said. He said it slowly, testing the weight of it. "I am his nephew. Yes, and I am the son of Rhaegar Targaryen. Yes, which makes me the grandson of Aerys II. His jaw tightened. "The Mad King." "It does," Aemon said, "as it makes me the great-uncle of Aerys II, and the product of a line that includes both the Dragon Knight and Maekar the Anvil and Baelor the Blessed, who starved himself to death, praying. Blood is not destiny, it is inheritance. What you do with it is the question." He turned his blind eyes toward Jon with that precise, unsettling accuracy. "But Jon, you are also the grandson of Rickard Stark, who died in a burning room with his son screaming for water in the next cell. You are also Lyanna's son. You are North in your bones, whatever fire runs in your blood. You are not lesser for knowing the truth. You have never been lesser. That is what I need you to hear before anything else is decided." Jon looked at the letter on the table for a long time. Then he picked it up, folded it twice, and put it inside his shirt, against his chest. He did not explain the gesture. He did not need to. He turned to Catelyn. She had been waiting for this. She had been composing herself for it during the 4 days between the Raven and his arrival, during the sleepless nights on a bunk in Castle Black that was too short and too cold, during every hour she had spent sitting with Aemon in the solar, listening to him talk about Targaryens she had never met, as if they were neighbors he had lost track of. She had thought about what to say. She had composed several versions. She had discarded all of them. She walked to the center of the room. She got down on her knees. The stone was cold through her riding clothes. The cold pressed up through her kneecaps immediately, sharp and specific, and she stayed where she was. She looked at Jon's boots, worn, re-soled once at least, the boots of a man who moved on his feet more than he rode. She made herself look up. Jon's face had gone very still. "I cannot give you 17 years, Catelyn said." Her voice was level. She had decided she would not let it break, not because she did not feel the breaking, but because he had earned a clear sentence more than she had earned the relief of weeping. "I cannot give you a name, or a mother, or any of the mornings in Winterfell that I made smaller than they should have been for you. I cannot give you back the table you should have sat at, or the name that should have been yours from the first hour." She kept her eyes on his face. "I can only give you this. You were never what I believed you to be. I looked at you and I saw a lie, and you were not the lie. You were the truth, and you were a child, and the fault of every hour of it was mine." She did not ask for forgiveness. She had thought about that word for 4 days, and arrived at the same place every time, that forgiveness was something she needed, not something he owed. And there was an important difference between the two that she had spent most of her life not understanding. Jon did not move for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and took her arm and brought her up from the floor. Not ceremonially. The way you help someone up when they have fallen. Practical, complete, no performance in it. His hand on her arm was a young man's hand, stark strong, cold from the wall. When she was standing again, he did not immediately release her arm. He said, "You were protecting your children. I understand that now better than I did." Catelyn looked at him. Jon. Not Jon Snow. He said it quietly. Not bitterly. Factually the way Aemon had been factual. Naming things by their true names because the false ones had done enough damage. Not Ned Stark's bastard. Not the lie Winterfell told itself. He looked at the place where the letter pressed against his chest from inside his shirt. I don't know yet what name I'm owed. But I know what I am, and what I am has never been less than anyone in that hall. He paused. Including you. It should have been an accusation. It was not. It was a statement of record, documented, sealed, closed. You are family, Jon said. Whatever else is decided, whatever comes next. You are Robb's mother, and you rode 6 weeks through a war to give me a truth that could have stayed buried. That is not nothing. He finally released her arm. It is not nothing at all. In the corner, Ghost rose from the floor, stretched once, and walked to Catelyn's side. The direwolf pressed its white flank against her leg and stood there, and she felt the warmth of the animal against her riding clothes, and she did not move, and she did not speak. Aemon said, from his chair, without turning his head, "Now. We discuss what comes next. Because the wall is cold, and the south is burning, and a great deal depends on the decisions made in the next hour." He folded his hands. "Sit down, both of you. We have work to do." Catelyn sat. Jon sat across from her. Between them, the fire and the letter's ghost in 17 years of a wrong that had no clean resolution, only a forward direction, only the work that waited on the other side of it. Aemon began to speak. Outside, the wall groaned in the wind. Ghost lay down at the foot of the table and closed his red eyes, and in the room above the cold world, the three of them began to build something from the wreckage of a very old lie. Mormont's solar had the quality of a room that had been organized once, long ago, by a man with different priorities than the man now living in it. There were shelves with books that had not been read in years, and maps that had been read so often they were wearing through at the folds. There was a desk with 2 chairs in front of it and 1 behind it. There was a fire. There was the raven, watching from its stand with the raven's complete absence of social awareness, its head rotating in small increments to track whoever spoke. Mormont sat behind the desk. Catelyn sat across from him. Aemon had been brought to the chair beside her. The steward placed him with the same practiced lightness as before, and then withdrew. Jon stood. He had not been invited to sit, and had not asked to, and Mormont had not offered, and all three of them understood that what was about to happen in this room was easier to do while standing than while seated at a table like equals discussing a shared problem. Catelyn placed the decree on the desk. Mormont looked at it. His eyes had the slightly effortful focus of a man whose vision had been declining long enough that he had developed compensatory habits, holding things at a specific distance, angling paper toward the light. He read it without touching it, the way experienced men read documents they are suspicious of. He read it through once. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the fire. "The seal is Robb Stark's," he said. "The king's seal. I recognize it. Yes, and the signature. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Where did he sign this?" "In his war camp in the Riverlands, at my request." Catelyn kept her voice level. "Before I rode north, he signed it without hesitation." "And the legal argument." Mormont laced his fingers together on the desk. He was not looking at the decree anymore. He was looking at Jon, who was standing near the door with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to let other people fight this particular battle and say nothing unless asked. "Your argument is that the vow was taken by a man who legally no longer exists. That Jon Snow the bastard has been replaced, by royal decree, by a true-born prince, and that a prince cannot be bound by a bastard's oath. That is one argument, Catelyn said. There are others. Give me the strongest one. She looked at Aemon. The old man had been sitting with his eyes directed somewhere slightly above and to the left of Mormont's desk, his resting orientation, the direction he faced when he was listening rather than speaking. He took a breath now that was not quite a sigh and was not quite preparation, but somewhere between the two. "Jor," Aemon said. Mormont looked at him. Something shifted in the Lord Commander's face. Not deference exactly, but the adjustment a man makes when someone speaks who has earned a different quality of attention than other people receive. "I have served the Watch for 60 years, Aemon said. I have said the words myself. I have heard them said 10,000 times in this yard by boys who were frightened and men who were desperate, and a handful of people, very few, who said them and meant every syllable. I know what the vow is." He paused. "I also know what the Watch is. Not what it was meant to be, what it is. What it has become. A garrison of 3,000 men, half of them criminals, a quarter of them starving, defending a structure that is cracking in places and understaffed in all of them. Against what is coming." He turned his blind face toward Mormont with that precise accuracy. "You know what is coming, Jor. You have read the Rangers' reports. You have seen what Sam Tarly brought back from beyond the wall. You know." Mormont said nothing. "The Watch exists to defend the realm of men," Aemon said. "That is the purpose. Not the institution. Not the tradition. Not the vow itself. The vow exists to serve the purpose, not the other way around. So I ask you a simple question, and I want you to sit with it before you answer it." He folded his hands. "Which defends the realm more completely? One sword on this wall, or one crown on the right head?" The fire moved. The raven turned its head 30 degrees to the left, then back. Mormont looked at Jon. Jon met his eyes and said nothing. He had said nothing for the entire conversation. He had stood near the door and breathed steadily and let the argument run its course, which was either extraordinary patience or extraordinary discipline or both, and Mormont had trained him long enough to know that it was both, and that the discipline was the thing he was most proud of and most reluctant to lose. "You were going to be my first ranger," Mormont said. The words came out quietly, not as an accusation, as a fact being set down. Something placed on a table carefully, because it was fragile. "You were going to be Lord Commander after me. I believed that. I still believe it." He looked at the decree on his desk. "The Watch doesn't have another Jon Snow to replace you with. I want you to understand that I am not unaware of what I am releasing." Jon spoke for the first time. "I know, my lord. Do you?" Mormont's voice had an edge now, not of anger, but of something older and less clean. The edge of a man who has given things away before and learned that the giving did not become easier with practice. "You know what it costs the Watch. You don't know yet what it costs me specifically, and I won't tell you, because it's not information you need, and it's not information I care to share. But I want you to know it costs something. I want that to mean something to you when you are standing south of here, in rooms that are warm, and decisions that are large, and you have forgotten what it felt like to be useful in a way that was simple." Jon did not look away. "It will mean something," he said. "It already does." Mormont looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and produced a quill and a pot of ink and a fresh piece of parchment. He wrote for 3 minutes in silence. The scratch of the quill was the only sound in the room besides the fire. He signed it, sanded it, pressed his seal into the wax with the Lord Commander's ring. He held it out across the desk, without standing. "Formal release," Mormont said. "Witnessed by myself and Maester Aemon. Recorded in the Watch's ledger. No man of the Watch will consider you a deserter or an oathbreaker. You leave with the Watch's knowledge, under protest, and with my personal," he stopped. Started again. "With my personal regard. Which is worth less than a signed decree, but more than I generally give." Jon crossed the room, took the document with both hands, held it for a moment. "Thank you," Jon said. "My lord." Mormont waved his hand once, a gesture that was not dismissal and was not welcome but was something in between, the gesture of a man ending a conversation, because continuing it would cost more than he intended to spend. He picked up the decree, Robb's decree, and set it in his desk drawer and closed the drawer. He did not look at Jon again. Jon left the solar. His room was small. It had always been small. A bunk, a chest, a shelf with 3 books that were not his, but that he had borrowed so long ago they had become his through occupation. The black cloak hung on a peg by the door, where it had hung for years, where it would hang for years after him, and then belong to someone else who would not know its history, and would not need to. Jon lifted it off the peg. The wool was thick and heavy and cold from the air near the door. The cold came in through the gap at the bottom no matter what you stuffed in it, and the cold always reached the cloak first. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than it looked. It always had been. He had thought when he was young that it was the wool. He knew now it was not the wool. He folded it once, folded it again, set it on the bunk with the precise, deliberate care of a man setting down something he will not pick back up, but is not ready to be careless with. The folds were even. The edges met cleanly. He smoothed the surface once with his palm, and then took his hand away. From his chest he took the clothes Catelyn had brought from Robb's camp. Northern gray wool, good quality, the kind of clothes that said house without declaring house. She had worked on the collar herself in the 3 nights between the Raven and his arrival, in the cold of the bunk they had given her, by the light of a single tallow candle. He had not known this until she handed them to him this morning, and he had looked at the stitching inside the collar and seen what she had sewn there. A 3-headed dragon, small, careful, red thread on gray wool, invisible unless you knew to look. He dressed without ceremony. The gray wool settled against his shoulders and the collar sat against his neck and beneath the collar. Pressed against his skin, the red dragon waited in its hiding place. Both things. Always both things. He had spent 16 years being one thing badly, the bastard, the wrong kind of Stark, the category error in Winterfell's ledger. Now he was 2 things truly, and the truth of both fit better than the lie of one had ever managed. He picked up Longclaw from the wall, set it on his hip. He did not look at the black cloak on the bunk again. He looked at it once and then did not, the way you do not look back at things you have decided about. He opened the door. Ghost was in the yard. The direwolf was sitting at the south gate, which was not the gate Jon normally used, which was not the gate that led to the ranging grounds or the training yard or any of the directions Ghost had learned in 2 years of Castle Black. It was the gate that led away from the wall. Ghost sat in front of it with his tail around his feet and his red eyes on Jon. And he had been there long enough that the snow around him held the impression of his sitting, which meant he had been there since before Jon left the solar. Jon crossed the yard. The men who watched, and they all watched, every man in that yard, finding reasons to be near a window, or a doorway, or a stretch of ground with a line of sight. The men who watched saw a boy they had trained beside walking toward a white wolf at a gate, dressed in gray instead of black, carrying himself in a way that was not different from how he had always carried himself, but that suddenly looked like something it had not looked like before. Like purpose with a destination. Jon opened the gate. Ghost walked through it. Jon followed. The road south was frozen solid and gray under an overcast sky, and the wind coming off the wall at their backs smelled like ice in distance, and Ghost walked at Jon's heel and did not look back, and Jon walked and did not look back, and behind them Castle Black stood in the cold, and the Raven in Mormont's solar turned its head and said nothing. The camp smelled of wood smoke and horse, and the specific metallic edge of men who had been fighting long enough that fighting had become a smell they carried in their clothes. It was bigger than Catelyn remembered. Robb's host had grown in the months since she had ridden south, swelled by Westerland's men changing sides and Riverland's lords reinforcing. And the camp had grown with it the way water spreads when a vessel overflows, finding the low ground, filling it, becoming a geography of its own. Cook fires and supply lines and blacksmiths and the quartered pavilions of a dozen lords, all organized around the central command tent that flew the Stark direwolf from its central pole. She had sent no raven ahead. She had decided that in the neck and held to it through the entire ride south, through every temptation to reach for a bird and announce what was coming. What she was carrying could not be put in a letter. What was about to happen in this camp required faces, not parchment. They rode in through the eastern approach at mid-morning. The first man to notice was not a man. Grey Wind was at the edge of the camp's perimeter, lying in the grass outside the picket line with his enormous head on his paws, watching the road with the casual totality of a predator that is never fully at rest. He was 2 years old and the size of a small horse, and the color of winter fog, and Robb's men had long since stopped being afraid of him and started being proud of him the way soldiers are proud of a weapon that belongs to them. Grey Wind saw Ghost first. The big gray wolf rose from the ground in a single fluid motion and stood absolutely still. His nose began to work, not quickly, not the rapid, excited investigation of an unfamiliar scent, but slowly, drawing deep, the extended and deliberate examination of something that required full attention. Jon and Ghost came up the road together, Jon riding and Ghost running loose alongside the horse, and Grey Wind held his ground, breathing Jon in. He stood like that for a long moment, utterly motionless, while the column approached. Then he walked forward, closed the remaining distance at a careful pace, and stopped 3 feet from Jon when Jon dismounted. He went still again. His red-brown eyes were fixed on Jon with the complete, unblinking attention of an animal that has identified something significant and is deciding what it means. Then he allowed Jon to place a hand on his broad gray head, and he did not pull away, and his tail moved once. A single, slow sweep. Every man within eyesight stopped. None of them spoke. Grey Wind knew every man in this camp. They had watched him track wildlings through forest and pull down stags in open ground and sleep across Robb Stark's feet like a dog 3 times his size. They had never seen him go still for a stranger the way he went still for this one. Something was happening, and none of them had words for it, only the animal certainty that it mattered. The word moved through the camp in the way words move through camps, not shouted, not organized, just passed from one set of eyes to the next until half the host had found reasons to be at the eastern edge of their portion of the camp, watching a man in gray wool stand with a white wolf at his heel and a gray wolf at his hand. Robb Stark came through the crowd 2 minutes later. He was already moving fast. Someone had run to tell him, which meant someone had understood, at least partially what was happening, and had prioritized telling the king. He pushed through the last group of men at the perimeter and stopped. He looked at the wolves. He looked at Jon. Jon looked back. Robb's face was doing something complicated. She could see it from 20 feet away, the relief crashing into the fear, crashing into the thing underneath both of them that was simply her son seeing his brother, the specific expression of a person who has been braced against grief for so long that the sudden absence of it is almost painful. He crossed the distance between them and gripped Jon's arm the way soldiers grip arms, the full forearm. And Jon gripped back, and for a moment they just stood there in the middle of a camp full of staring men, holding on. The command tent was emptied on Robb's word. The lords and captains withdrew without enthusiasm, glancing back over their shoulders, and the tent flap closed behind the last of them and left Jon and Robb alone, except for the maps and the candles and the low sound of the camp outside the canvas. Robb put his hands on the map table and looked at his brother. "Tell me," he said. "All of it." Jon told him. He did not pace. He did not soften the sequence, or lead into it carefully, or construct it rhetorically. He laid it out the way Aemon had laid things out. This is true, this is true, this is what follows, and Robb listened without speaking until it was finished. The parentage. The letter. Aemon's testimony. The decree. The release from the watch. All of it. When Jon stopped, Robb was quiet for a long time. "Rhaegar Targaryen," Robb said finally, not as a question, processing it. "Lyanna's son. My father's nephew." He looked at the tent ceiling. "My cousin." "Yes," Robb exhaled slowly through his nose. "And the throne. You have a claim to the Iron Throne. Better than Joffrey's. Better than Stannis. Better than anyone currently sitting south of this table." "Yes, and what do you want to do with that?" Jon met his eyes. "I want your army, not your kingdom. I want the command that lets me take Casterly Rock and end this war before the thing coming from beyond the wall is everyone's problem instead of only the Watch's. Give me that, And everything else is a conversation we have later, when the Lannisters are finished." Robb looked at him for a long time. The candlelight moved in a draft from somewhere. Outside, a horse complained briefly and was quiet. "You could take the whole thing," Robb said. "Not from me, I'd give it willingly, you know I would. But from the realm. You have the blood. You have the name. Some lords would rally to a Targaryen who could fight. You know that. I know that. And you're not interested." "I'm interested in the dead," Jon said. "The ones the Lannisters made and the ones the North is going to produce if we are still fighting each other when the real enemy arrives. The Iron Throne can wait. It has waited 17 years already." He looked at Robb steadily. "Your kingdom is yours. I am not here to take it. I am here because you are my brother, and your mother rode 6 weeks through a war to give me my name back, and because this army is the only instrument large enough to do what needs doing. That is all." Robb looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the short, decisive nod of a king making a decision rather than a boy making a choice. "You'll have it," he said. "The command. Full tactical authority over the Western campaign." He put his hand out flat on the map. "And Jon, when the lords meet this afternoon, when Mother reads the decree, whatever noise Karstark makes, whatever Bolton does with his face, you stand in the center of it, and you don't explain yourself. You don't argue your right. You let the blood speak." "The blood," Jon said, "looks Stark." For the first time since the tent flap closed, Robb smiled. "Yes," he said, "it does." The Westerland's grass was shorter than northern grass. Jon noticed it the afternoon before the battle, lying on his stomach on the ridge above Stafford Lannister's camp, with Robb on one side and a scout named Heir on the other, looking down at 10,000 men who did not know they were being looked at. He noticed the grass because he was looking at the ground the way Mormont had trained him to look at ground, not as scenery but as information, and the information the grass gave him was this: it was dry, shorter and drier, and less forgiving than anything the North grew, the kind of ground that did not absorb sound the way bog and moorland absorb sound. The kind of ground that transmitted footfall like a drum if you were not careful about where and how you placed your feet. He filed it away. He looked at the horse lines. There were 400 horses picketed on the western edge of the camp, below a natural windbreak of scrub oak that had seemed like good thinking to whoever arranged the camp, and was in fact the worst decision Stafford Lannister's quartermaster had ever made. The windbreak meant the horses were invisible from 3 sides and accessible from 1. The trees meant there was cover for an approach. The picket lines ran east to west, 40 animals per line, 10 lines, rope and iron stakes in dry ground that would pull free faster than wet ground if something panicked the horses. "There," Jon said. He did not point. He kept his hand flat and gestured with his chin, the way ranging taught you to gesture when you were on a ridge above an enemy who might be looking up. "That's the target, not the gate, not the command tent. The horses." Robb studied the western edge. "You cut the horses, they can't pursue. Can't reform on open ground. They can't do anything on open ground without horses, except stand and receive. That's not a battle. That's a harvest." Jon shifted back from the ridge lip below the sightline. "Your force hits the main gate at the 3rd hour of night. Loud, all the noise we have, drums, horns, everything. Draw every man who has a weapon toward the eastern side of the camp. My unit goes in from the west, through the trees, and we cut every picket line we can reach before the alarm gets loud enough to bring men back our way. How many men do you need?" 30. Jon looked at him. "Fast men. Quiet men. No plate, leather only. Nothing that rings." Robb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the camp, and then at Jon, and then at the camp again, running the numbers, measuring the risk against the weight of what winning here would mean. Stafford Lannister's host was newly raised, green soldiers, men who had not yet learned that the sound of a night alarm was information rather than a command to run toward whatever was making it. Green soldiers in the dark, without horses, with a northern army hitting their front and an unknown force hitting their rear. The math was not complicated. "Take them," Robb said. "And Jon, we need prisoners worth ransoming. This costs us nothing if we burn the camp and leave." "We won't burn anything," Jon said. "Burning tells them how we think." The third hour of night smelled like burnt tallow and old sweat, and the particular staleness of 10,000 men sleeping in proximity, which was a smell Jon had known since his first ranging beyond the wall, and which never became anything you wanted to breathe if you had a choice. He had no choice. His unit was 30 men from 3 different houses, Mormont men, Umber men. 8 of the Glover household who had volunteered specifically because their lord told them not to, all of them in leather, all of them with their boots treated with rendered fat to reduce the squeak against the dry grass, all of them moving in single file through the scrub oak with Ghost at the front of the column, moving ahead of the men by 20 yards, nose down, ears rotating. Ghost stopped twice. Both times Jon stopped the column with a raised fist and they waited, and both times a Lannister sentry completed his patrol route 40 feet away and moved back toward the firelight without looking into the trees. Jon watched the sentries the way the ranging had taught him to watch, not at the man, but at the edge of the man's attention, at where his eyes went and where they didn't. A sentry's attention had geography. There were places it went habitually and places it never went, and the places it never went were where you walked. He walked there. The first alarm horn blew from the eastern camp. Robb's force, on schedule. The sound hit the camp like something physical. Jon could see it from the tree line. The way the firelight changed as men who had been asleep became men who were standing. Voices, running feet. The specific chaotic energy of a camp that has just been told it is under attack and has not yet been told from where. Jon broke from the trees, 30 men behind him, moving fast across the 60 yards of open ground between the scrub oak and the first picket line. Ghost reached the horses 4 seconds ahead of the men, and that was enough. The nearest animals smelled the wolf, and the nearest animals communicated what they smelled the way horses always communicated danger, instantly and completely. And the picket lines went taut, with 40 animals pulling in 40 different directions before Jon's knife touched the first rope. He cut. Moved to the next stake. Cut, a horse shoulder hit him and spun him sideways, and he planted his foot and cut the next line without stopping. Around him his men were doing the same, methodical, fast, staying low under the horses' line of sight, because the horses were not the danger, the horses were the work, and the danger would come from the east when the camp organized itself enough to send men this direction. The first 3 lines went in under 2 minutes, 120 horses loose and moving, which produced a sound and a chaos that was its own force multiplier. Men on foot cannot organize in the dark with 120 panicking animals moving through their camp. The horses did more damage in the next 10 minutes than Jon's 30 men could have done in an hour. He found Stafford Lannister by accident. The man was trying to reach the horse lines from the opposite direction, presumably the same logic Jon had used, understanding that the horses were the critical point. He had 4 men with him, household knights in hastily buckled armor, and he was moving fast and purposefully, and looked nothing like a man who was losing. He had the build of someone who had been a soldier once, and allowed it to go comfortable, wide through the chest and thicker at the middle than a young man, with a gray-streaked beard and the expression of a commander who had been woken from sleep and was angry about it rather than afraid. He saw Jon at the same moment Jon saw him. 10 yards of open ground between them, lit by the burning supply wagon that one of Jon's men had torched 3 minutes ago. Stafford drew his sword. His 4 knights spread to his flanks. Jon did not draw a long claw. He dropped to a knee, and Ghost came through the firelight from the left. No sound, no warning, just the white wolf at full extension. And the nearest knight went down under the wolf's weight, and the other 3 broke, not running but backpedaling, the involuntary retreat of men whose bodies decided before their minds did. In the 2 seconds that cost Stafford Lannister, Jon crossed the distance. He hit Stafford with his shoulder, not his blade, drove him back. Stafford was heavier and did not go down, but he could not swing in the clinch, and Jon's knee found the inside of his thigh and buckled the leg, and Stafford went to one knee, and Jon had his arm up and back and Longclaw at his throat before the man could bring his sword around. "Yield," Jon said. Stafford looked at the blade, looked at the burning camp beyond Jon's shoulder, looked at the white wolf holding one of his knights on the ground 10 feet away with its jaws around the man's forearm, not tearing, holding. He let his sword fall. The camp burned anyway. Not on Jon's order, on the momentum of 200 men who came through the gate after Robb's force broke it, and momentum is difficult to argue with. Jon stood at the edge of it with Ghost at his heel and watched the fires, and did not feel what he had expected to feel, which was something. He felt the cold of the Westerland's night and the ache in his shoulder where Stafford had connected once before going to his knee, and he felt the specific tiredness that came after fighting, which was not like other kinds of tired. It lived behind the eyes. Robb found him there. He crossed the firelit yard and stood beside Jon and looked at the same fires for a moment without speaking. He had blood on his jaw from a cut that had already stopped. His sword was sheathed. "Stafford Lannister is alive," Jon said. "Secured. You'll get the ransom." "I know. Harren told me." Robb looked at the horse lines, empty now, stakes pulled free, ropes trailing. "You cut 8 lines. 9, one of the later ones the horses cut themselves." Robb was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. Someone was shouting orders in the middle of the camp, and someone else was shouting back, and the argument resolved itself without anyone dying, which was how arguments resolved themselves after a victory. "You think like a general," Robb said. Jon looked at the burnt supply wagon, the one his man had torched, the one whose light had let him find Stafford. He had not ordered it. He would have, given another minute. "I think like someone who has been on the wrong side of a battle," he said. "The wall teaches you fast. The things that come over it don't fight the way soldiers fight. They don't care about the gate or the command tent. They go for what keeps you alive. Warmth, food, the ability to run." He looked at the empty picket lines. "Once you understand that, everything else is a variation." Robb looked at him. "When this is over," he said, "when the Lannisters are finished, and the realm has a moment to breathe, we need to talk about the North's defenses. About the wall. About what you know that the rest of us don't." "We will," Jon said. "How bad is it?" Jon looked north, though there was nothing to see in that direction except the Westerland's dark. "Bad enough that this," he said, gesturing at the burning camp, at the victory, at the 10,000 men they had just removed from Tywin Lannister's reach, needs to be finished quickly. All of it. The war, the politics, the Lannister problem. Every week we spend here is a week the wall spends shorthanded." Robb absorbed that. He did not dismiss it or argue with it. He had learned, in the months since Catelyn had read the decree, that Jon did not use words as currency. He spent them carefully, and only when they were worth the spending. "Then we move on Casterly Rock," Robb said, "as soon as Karstark is dealt with." "Yes, and if Karstark leaves us? Takes his men?" Jon looked at the fire. The supply wagon was mostly ash now, the wood consumed, the iron fittings glowing orange in the coals. "Then we take the rock with fewer men," he said, "and we do it faster, because we can't afford to wait for men who have already decided which direction they're going." The council met in the command tent at mid-morning, which was the wrong time for a confrontation because mid-morning was when men were sharpest and most certain of themselves, and certainty in a council tent was a different animal than certainty on a battlefield. On a battlefield it kept you moving. In a tent it kept you from listening. Jon knew before he entered that Karstark was going to do it today. He had known for 3 days, the way you know weather before it arrives, not from a single sign but from the accumulation of small ones. The way Karstark had positioned himself at the previous council, always across the table from Jon rather than beside him. The way his household men had begun taking their meals separately from the Umber and Mormont contingents. The way Karstark himself had looked at Jon during the Oxcross accounting, when Jon stood before the assembled lords and described the tactical sequence, and Karstark's face had done nothing, which was worse than any expression it could have done. A man whose face does nothing has already decided. Jon sat at the table's right side, where Robb had placed him. Ghost was outside the tent, too large for the space with 12 men in it, and the lords were still, most of them, not entirely comfortable with the wolf's presence in enclosed rooms. Robb sat at the table's head. Catelyn sat to Robb's left. Roose Bolton sat at the table's far end, arranged in his habitual posture of comfortable attention, a man at his ease in any room, because he had decided long ago that rooms could not threaten him. Rickard Karstark sat directly across from Jon. The council ran its course. Supply counts. The Lannister response to Oxcross, scattered, slow. Tywin at Harrenhal moving pieces on a board that was 3 moves behind the reality on the ground. Robb's proposed advance toward the rock. The question of forage. The question of the Tyrells, who were watching from the Reach with the patient attention of people who intended to back the winner and were waiting for the winner to become identifiable. When the council's formal business was finished, Karstark spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at Jon with the calm of a man who has been composing something for days and is finally in the room where he gets to say it. "I want to address the command structure," Karstark said. "Specifically, the decision to give tactical authority over the Western campaign to a man who, under Westerosi law and the traditions of the Night's Watch, gave up any claim to command the moment he said his vows." The tent went quiet. "Rickard," Robb began. "My Lord King." Karstark did not look at Robb. He looked at Jon. "With respect, this is not a question about your decree. The decree is signed, it is sealed. I am not disputing the parchment. I am disputing the man behind it." He paused. "A man who swore to the Night's Watch swears away more than his name. He swears away his blood, his inheritance, and his honor to any house and any cause other than the Watch itself. That is the vow. That is what the vow means. It does not say, it has never said, unless a king later decides otherwise. If royal decrees can undo sworn oaths, then no oath in this kingdom means anything at all. Not the oath of service, not the marriage oath, not the oath a lord swears to his king. He let that sit for a moment, not the oath a king swears to his lords." Nobody moved. Jon looked at Karstark and understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the argument was not wrong. Not entirely. It had a spine, a real one, and the men at this table knew it, and dismissing it with authority rather than logic would cost more than it saved. The second was that the argument was not the actual argument. The argument was the architecture. The motive was elsewhere. "You're right," Jon said. Karstark's eyes shifted. He had not expected that. "The vow is absolute," Jon said. "I took it. I meant it when I took it. I stood in that yard in the cold and said those words, and I was not performing. I was committing, and there is a difference, and I know which one I was doing." He kept his voice level. "You're right that a piece of parchment does not dissolve the weight of an oath. You're right that if oaths bend for kings, they bend for everyone. These are real problems. I am not going to tell you they aren't." Karstark waited. "I'm going to tell you something else," Jon said. "Something you don't know yet. Something only the men who have ranged beyond the wall know. And I know because I am one of them and was one of them when this debate about my vow did not exist, when I was simply a ranger doing the job." He reached inside his riding cloak. He set the piece of dragon glass on the table, a shard the size of his palm, black and sharp-edged, volcanic glass that caught the candlelight wrong. Maester Aemon had pressed it into his hand the morning he walked south through Castle Black's gate, retrieved from a box the old man kept above his bed, a piece Aemon had held for years as a reminder of what the wall truly guarded against. Jon had carried it since. "Obsidian," Karstark said. Dismissive. "Dragonglass. You've brought us a rock. I've brought you the only material in the known world that kills what is coming over that wall." Jon did not raise his voice. "The White Walkers are not dead. The army of the dead is not a story told to frighten children into sleeping. I have seen them. I have stood in ranging parties that encountered them, and I have watched what happens to men who face them without dragonglass or Valyrian steel, which are the only 2 things that stop them." He looked around the table. "They do not die from ordinary steel. They do not feel cold the way we feel cold. They are cold. They are made from it. They move through it like we move through air. And they raise the dead. Every man who falls in front of them stands up again on their side. Every man." The tent was very quiet. "Maester Aemon Targaryen has written a full account," Catelyn said from Robb's left. Her voice was controlled, placed carefully into the silence. "He is nearly 100 years old, and has served the wall for 60 years. He is the last Targaryen who lived in the world before the current dynasty. His testimony is in writing, witnessed, sealed with the Watch's own maester's chain. She did not look at Karstark. She looked at the room. It names what is coming. It names when. It names the dragonglass as the specific defense, and it names the wall as the specific barrier, and it names what happens if the wall is undermanned when the enemy arrives. Karstark looked at the dragonglass. He looked at Jon. He was not a stupid man. This was important to understand about him. He was a man whose intelligence had been consumed by a single, devouring grief, the way fire consumes a room from the inside, burning everything in the same space until the room itself is the fire and nothing else. He understood the argument. He heard it. He weighed it in the moment with the part of him that was still capable of weighing things. The part that was still capable of weighing things was losing. "You are asking me," Karstark said slowly, "to set aside my objection to a man who broke his oath because the threat he names from beyond the wall is larger than the question of his oath." "I am asking you," Jon said, "to ask yourself one question. Not about my oath, not about the decree, about your sons." He waited for Karstark's eyes to come up, and when they did, he held them. Torrhen and Eddard Karstark died for a cause. They died fighting men who can be killed by ordinary steel, who can be burned, who can be starved, who have mothers and sons of their own and can be turned and broken the way men are turned and broken. The Lannisters are enemies. They are human enemies, and human enemies can be defeated. He paused. What comes over that wall cannot be defeated by ordinary men fighting in ordinary ways. It will raise your sons' bodies and march them south against everything you love. And the only reason we have any chance of preventing that is if this army finishes the Lannister war fast enough to turn north before the wall falls. He picked up the dragonglass and held it for a moment and set it back down. "So, which fight do you want to win? The one for your honor, or the one for your sons?" Karstark stared at him. Something moved through the man's face, not the thaw of a man being persuaded, but the tightening of a man who has been presented with a truth he cannot afford to accept, because accepting it would require him to let go of the only thing he had left, which was the right to his rage. He stood. He did not look at Robb. He looked at Jon, for a long moment, with an expression that was not quite hatred and not quite respect, and was precisely the mixture of both that men carry when they have been beaten by an argument rather than a sword. "I will not ride under his command," Karstark said. "I have said my piece. The decree stands. The law is as it is. But I will not serve under a man who said those vows and walks away from them because a king tells him to. And I will not pretend otherwise for the convenience of this council." He walked to the tent flap. He stopped without turning around. "My 2,000 men ride at dawn," he said. "North, to the Dreadfort and our own walls." He paused. "When this army needs men, Lord Stark, it will find Karstark men behind Karstark walls. Whether they ride out of those walls depends on what this council does in the months ahead." He left. The tent was silent. Outside, his footsteps faded across the packed ground of the camp, and then were gone, and the gap where 2,000 men had stood in the army's count settled into the space between the remaining lords like cold air through a door left open. Robb looked at the table. Jon looked at the dragonglass. Roose Bolton looked at the tent flap through which Karstark had disappeared, and his expression was that of a man watching an opportunity take its proper shape. He blinked once. He looked back at his folded hands. He said nothing. "We move on Casterly Rock," Jon said, "with what we have." Nobody argued. Casterly Rock was not a castle either. It was a mountain that had decided to become one. The rock itself was 3 miles long and half a mile high at its tallest point. A mass of tawny sandstone rising from the coast of the Westerlands, with the absolute indifference of something that had been there before men arrived and expected to be there after men were finished. The castle was built into it rather than on top of it, carved from the inside, growing outward over centuries, incorporating the rock's natural features the way a tree incorporates a fence post it has grown around. Towers emerged from cliff faces. Gates opened in what looked like solid stone. The walls were the rock, and the rock was the walls, and the difference between them was architectural opinion rather than physical fact. Jon stood on the ridge above Lannisport and looked at it for a long time. Robb stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. The harbor below was quiet in the specific way of a harbor that has been blocked for 3 weeks. The stillness of trade stopped, of supply lines cut, of a city that was beginning to understand that the water it depended on was no longer bringing anything it needed. The Riverland's river galleys sat at the harbor's mouth in a line, their hulls low and dark in the morning light, supplemented by 11 iron-borne ships captured during the Neck Crossing and turned south under Mormont men who had learned seamanship from books, because the North did not produce sailors the way the Iron Islands did, but produced men who learned things they needed to learn. The fleet was not elegant. It was sufficient. "They've stopped sending out testing ships," Robb said. 3 days ago. Jon had been watching the harbor daily since the blockade set. They know the line holds. They're rationing now. He looked at the rock's eastern face, the cliff that dropped straight into the water below the castle's main bulk, the face that received no sun in the afternoon and was therefore the coldest and least observed. "It changes what they'll do when we move. They'll defend the main gate," Robb said. "Every man they have, on the gate and the walls above it. The rock on the land side is where they'll concentrate." "Yes," Jon said. "Which is what I need them to do." He looked back at the map he carried in his head, the intelligence accumulated over 3 weeks of watching the rock from every accessible angle. Tywin was inside. Bolton's ravens had tracked his movement from Harrenhal to the rock 6 weeks ago, the old lion withdrawing when the Westerland's field position became untenable, retreating to the one fortress he believed could not fall. He had chosen correctly, in most respects. The rock's landward approaches were impregnable. He had not considered the water. The intelligence came from a woman. She was brought to Jon's tent 2 days before the assault by a Mormont man who had found her on the Lannisport docks, a household laundress from the rock itself, 40 years old, gray-haired, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been afraid for long enough that fear had become a physical condition rather than an emotional one. She had come down from the rock 3 weeks ago on legitimate business and had not gone back, which was a form of decision she had not made formally, but had made nonetheless. She did not know about the sewers. She did not know about any of the rock's interior systems with enough specificity to be militarily useful. She knew the kitchens and the laundry and the servants' corridors and the way the light moved through the lower levels at different times of day, which was the knowledge of a woman who had worked in the same building for 20 years and noticed the things that repeated, because repeated things built the rhythm of a working life. She knew about the loading dock. She described it as a practical thing rather than a secret one. A notch cut into the eastern cliff face at the waterline, accessible by boat in the pre-dawn hours, when the tide was fully out and the notch sat above the surface by 4 feet. Merchants had used it for years to supply the castle privately, she said, without the formality of the main gate and its gate tax and its recording of every item that entered. It was not hidden. It was simply inconvenient and cold and smelled of fish and old rope, which meant that people with better options used the main gate and people without better options used the notch. Jon listened to her description twice. He asked specific questions about the guards, how many, where they stood, whether they changed at predictable intervals. She answered with the precision of a woman who had learned to be precise about the movements of people who could make her day better or worse, depending on their mood. She knew the guard schedule the way she knew the laundry schedule. It was simply information she had absorbed over 20 years of being invisible in a room that powerful men moved through without noticing her. He thanked her. He meant it. The assault team was 28 men, not 30. 2 of the Glover men had taken fever from the Westerland's damp, and Jon had left them behind without discussion. 28 was enough. 28 was actually better. Fewer boats, less water sound, smaller profile approaching the eastern cliff in the pre-dawn dark. The boats were fishing vessels from Lannisport's lower harbor, 4 of them, shallow-drafted and dark-hulled and smelling of the fish they had last carried 4 weeks ago, when fishing had still been a thing the harbor did. Jon's men had treated the oarlocks with fat, and the oars themselves moved in near silence through the water, which was black and cold and reflected nothing, because there was no moon, and the clouds had arrived at midday like a courtesy. Ghost had not stayed on the ridge. Jon discovered this when they were still 200 yards from the eastern cliff, a pale shape in the water off the starboard bow. Moving without sound, the white wolf swimming in long, slow strokes, parallel to the boats. He had broken from the ridge some time between the departure and the water, and he had found the boats in the dark by means Jon did not understand, and had learned not to question. He reached the loading dock platform ahead of the boats, and pulled himself out of the water onto the salt-bleached planks, and stood there dripping, looking back at Jon with red eyes that held no apology for the change of plan. Jon looked at him for a moment. Kept moving. The notch was exactly as described, 4 feet of clearance above the water, a wooden platform inside it, old, salt, bleached, with iron rings set in the stone above it for mooring lines. 1 torch bracket, empty, 1 guard, sitting on the platform with his back against the stone and his chin on his chest, in the posture of a man who had found a way to sleep while technically maintaining a post, and had been doing so long enough that the rock had worn the shape of his shoulders into it. Jon was over the gunwale and onto the platform in a single movement, and he was across the platform in 4 steps, and the guard woke to the feeling of a hand over his mouth and a blade at his throat, and did not make a sound because those were the correct responses to a hand over your mouth and a blade at your throat. He did not kill the man. He bound him with rope from the boat and left him against the stone, and moved into the loading dock's interior passage, and his 28 men came up behind him in silence, and Ghost moved ahead down the passage with his nose down, and the passage swallowed them all. Robb's assault on the main gate began 20 minutes later. Jon heard it from inside the rock. The sound moving through the stone itself rather than through the air. A transmitted percussion, drums and horns, and the specific noise of a large force positioning itself against a fortification. The sound changed the interior of the castle the way wind changes a candle, everything bending in the same direction, every man with a weapon moving toward the disturbance. Jon moved in the opposite direction. He had the laundress's description in his head, specific, correct, oriented by the location of the loading dock, which was the fixed point around which everything else arranged itself. The servants' passages ran parallel to the main corridors and connected to them at intervals. The kitchen level was below the Great Hall level. The Great Hall level was below the Lord's Chambers. The Lord's Chambers were where Tywin Lannister lived when he was in residence at the Rock, and the Solar was where a man like Tywin would be on a morning when his castle was under assault, because Tywin Lannister conducted wars from chairs and always had. They took the servants' stairs. They moved past 2 kitchen workers who flattened themselves against the wall and were left there unharmed. They moved past a door that smelled of horses and was therefore the wrong door. They found the secondary gate, a smaller gate, interior, connecting the servants' level to the main passage, and Jon lifted the bar from the inside and pushed it open, and 2 of his men held it while another 12 went back to let Robb's vanguard in. He left 14 men at the gate and took the remaining 14 up. The Solar door was not locked. Jon opened it. Tywin Lannister was sitting at his desk. He was writing. Not frantically, not with the urgency of a man whose castle was falling, with the measured, deliberate pace of a man finishing a thought he had started before the noise began, and intended to complete before he addressed the noise. The quill moved across the parchment in careful lines. He did not look up immediately. When he did look up, his face did nothing that Jon had not expected. It arranged itself into the expression of a man confronting an unexpected situation who had decided that the situation did not warrant any of the reactions available to him. He set the quill down. He looked at Jon, at the gray wool, at the Stark bearing, at the face that was not a face he recognized. He looked at Ghost, who had come up ahead through the passage and was now sitting in the doorway with his red eyes on the old man in the chair, still damp from the harbor, leaving a dark, wet outline on the stone floor beneath him. "You are not a Lannister man," Tywin said. His voice was the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime using it as a tool rather than an expression, calibrated even, giving nothing away. "No," Jon said. He crossed the Solar. He stopped in front of the desk. "I am Jon Snow. I am also Aegon Targaryen. My grandfather died for your king. I intend to outlast yours." Tywin Lannister looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the wolf in the doorway. He looked at the 14 men filling the Solar behind Jon. He looked at the parchment in front of him, the letter he had been writing, which was finished, which he had not yet sanded. He picked up the sand jar, sanded the letter, folded it, pressed his ring into the cooling wax with the deliberate care of a man who finishes what he starts, regardless of circumstances. Then he set his hands flat on the desk and said, "Sit down." Jon did not sit. No. Tywin looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once, a single, minimal acknowledgement, the smallest possible motion that still constituted a concession, and pushed back his chair and stood, and was simply an old man in a room that had just stopped being his. The great hall of Casterly Rock smelled of old wealth. Not the current kind, not the fresh minted smell of a house at its height, of new cloth and imported spices, and the particular sweetness of candles made from quality tallow. Old wealth, the kind that had been accumulating in the same stone for 800 years, soaked into the walls and the floors and the massive beams overhead until the smell was not a smell anymore, but a property of the air itself. Generations of Lannister feasts and Lannister fires and Lannister decisions that moved armies the way other men moved furniture had pressed themselves into this room's memory, and the room held them the way old stone holds everything. Completely, without judgment, without any particular interest in what came next. Jon sat across a table from Tywin Lannister for 3 hours. He did not find it comfortable. He had not expected to. Tywin negotiated the way he wrote, with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who had decided that every word leaving his mouth was a resource to be allocated rather than an expression to be had, who had learned so long ago that showing nothing gave you everything that he had forgotten, if he ever knew how to show anything at all. He sat in his chair with his hands flat on the table, and his face arranged into the expression of a man at a council rather than a man in a defeated castle, and he negotiated. Jon negotiated back. He had 3 demands, and he did not vary them, and he did not trade them, and he did not soften them for the hour of the conversation, or the temperature of the room, or the specific quality of Tywin's silences, which were the kind of silences designed to make younger men fill them with concessions. Sansa Stark, released from King's Landing and returned north, unharmed, unchaperoned, with a formal Lannister letter of passage and a Lannister escort to the neck. Formal recognition of Robb Stark's sovereignty over the North and the Riverlands, in writing, under Tywin Lannister's seal, to be distributed to every lord in the realm. A permanent armistice. The Lannisters keep the Westerlands. The North keeps the North. The Rock keeps its gold and its name and its future. No reprisals, no continued hostilities, no proxy wars through bannermen. Done. Tywin listened to all 3 demands on the first pass without speaking. On the second pass he said, "The girl is not in my custody." Jon said, "She is in Lannister custody, which is yours." Tywin said, "Joffrey may resist the order." Jon said, "Joffrey resists what you allow him to resist. You and I both know that." The third silence was the longest. Then Tywin said, "The armistice terms as stated give you the North and the Riverlands, without requiring you to acknowledge the Iron Throne's authority over either." Jon said, "Yes." Tywin looked at him for a long time and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He signed all 3 documents before sundown. Jon did not feel what he had thought he would feel when the seal went into the wax. He thought he would feel the shape of the victory, its weight, and its dimension. He felt instead the specific tiredness that follows sustained effort. The body's acknowledgement that it has been asked to do something difficult for a long time and is now being told it can stop, and is not yet sure what stopping feels like. He rolled the documents. He stood. He said, "My lord." He left. The great hall had been cleared of the Lannister household and filled with Stark men and their lords, which changed it in ways that were practical before they were symbolic. The tapestries depicting Lannister victories were still on the walls because no one had had time to take them down. The long tables were still set with Lannister plate because no one had had time to replace it. The room was the same room, gold and red and old wealth, and into it had been placed a collection of northern men who wore gray and brown, and the particular uniform of people who had been at war for a year, and looked it, and the contrast was stark and intentional, and neither side pretended otherwise. Robb stood at the room's center. He had washed the road off and changed his clothes, and still looked exactly as young as he was, which was the honest version of him that Jon had always preferred to the performed version, the version with the crown and the title and the war king bearing that he wore in council, the way Catelyn had taught him to wear formal clothes, correctly, but with the slight awareness of a person who knows they are wearing something. Here, now, in this room, with the business finished and the documents signed, and the army secured and no more council to perform for, Robb Stark looked 16 years old and tired and relieved in the deep, structural way of someone who has been holding something up for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. He was holding a crown. Not the Iron Throne's crown, not any kind of southern crown. A northern thing. Black iron, simple, the width of a finger, with no ornamentation except for 2 figures worked in silver on either side of the front, a direwolf on the left, small and precise, and a 3-headed dragon on the right, the same size, the same weight of silver, neither one larger than the other. Jon looked at it and looked at Catelyn, who was standing at the room's edge, and she looked back at him, and he understood who had commissioned it and when, and did not say anything. Robb said, "Kneel." Jon knelt on the stone floor of Casterly Rock's great hall, which was cold through his riding clothes immediately, the specific cold of stone that had never been warm. He kept his back straight. He looked at the Lannister tapestries on the far wall and did not blink. The crown was heavier than it looked. It settled onto his head with the weight of iron, which was not symbolic weight, but actual weight, and the actual weight was enough. He felt it across his brow and along his temples, and at the base of his skull where the metal met his hair. And he understood in a physical way that crowns were not decorative but load-bearing, and that the load was not metaphorical, and that this was perhaps the most honest thing about them. Robb stepped back. The room was quiet for a moment, not the strategic quiet of a pause before a declaration, but the organic quiet of people who have just witnessed something they are still processing. Then the Great Jon's voice came from somewhere near the back, not a shout this time, something lower and more complete, the declaration of a man who is not performing, but simply stating what he knows to be true. "King Jon," the Great Jon said. The room followed. She was at the window when he found her, not looking through it. The window looked out over the Westerland's coast and the harbor and the fleet of river galleys and iron-borne ships sitting in the evening light, which was the view of a victory, and Catelyn was not looking at the victory. She was looking at the stone of the window frame itself, at the place where her hand rested against it, at nothing in particular, which was the way people look when they are finally allowing themselves to feel something they have been refusing to feel for a long time. Jon stood beside her and did not speak immediately. The evening light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the stone floor of the antechamber in a long bar of amber, and outside the harbor was the gold of late sun on water. And somewhere in the hall behind them men were eating and laughing with the particular relief of soldiers who have won. He would have been proud, Catelyn said. She was not asking whether it was true. She was simply saying it, setting it down in the room the way you set down something you have carried alone for a long time when you are finally somewhere safe enough to put it. "Yes," Jon said. He would have been furious about the method, and proud about the result. Both in equal parts for approximately 20 minutes, and then he would have started worrying about what came next. Something moved through Catelyn's face, not a smile exactly. The shape of one, the outline of it, worn slightly by the grief underneath. "He always worried about what came next," she said. "I know." She turned and looked at him, at the crown and the gray wool and the red dragon hidden inside the collar, which she knew was there because she had put it there herself in the dark of a castle-black bunk with cold fingers and a single candle. She looked at him the way she had not been able to look at him for 17 years, without the architecture of the wrong belief between them. Without the distance the lie had required. He would have called this impossible, she said. He would have been right. Jon looked at the door that led back to the hall, to the men and the noise and the weight of what the crown meant. "It is impossible. We did it anyway." She reached out and took his hand, not ceremonially, the way you take a hand when you need to hold something real. He let her, and they stood at the window while the evening finished, and the harbor lights came up, and the coast of the Westerlands went from gold to gray to dark. The map was on the table in the solar that had been Tywin Lannister's, and was now Jon's, at least for tonight, at least until morning brought the decisions of what came next, and what came after that. Ghost lay at the foot of the table with his chin on his paws and his red eyes half closed, the posture of a wolf that was not asleep, but was resting, which were different things. Jon stood over the map. His hands were flat on the table, Ned's posture, which he had absorbed without knowing he was absorbing it across 16 years of watching a man stand the same way in the same position. The map was a Lannister map, well made, detailed, the 7 kingdoms rendered in ink with trade routes and castle symbols, and the great features of the land named in the precise hand of a maester who had been thorough. The south was dense with information. The Westerlands, the Reach, the Crownlands, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, where the war had been fought and was now finished. The north of the map was different. Past the Neck, past Moat Cailin, past Winterfell and the Last Hearth, and the Shadow Tower, the map became spare, fewer names, wider spaces, the land rendered in the broad strokes of a cartographer who had not been there and had drawn from other people's accounts. And north of the wall, the map was nearly empty. A blank space. The cartographer's honest admission that what lay beyond the wall was not known well enough to draw. Catelyn appeared in the doorway. She did not enter. She stood in the frame of it the way people stand when they are not sure whether the room wants them yet. Jon looked at the blank space north of the wall for a long moment. "Now," he said, "we save the world." He looked up. He found Catelyn's eyes across the room. Ghost lifted his head from his paws. The fire in the Solar's hearth moved in a draft from the window, and the map's blank northern space flickered in the light of it, and outside the rock the ocean was dark, and the stars were coming out one by one over the Westerlands coast. They had one war behind them. The real one was still coming. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.